Good afternoon. I am Tom Putnam, the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and I took the title today, My Favorite Things, quite literally. So this is a personal favorite of mine because it has some meaning to me in my life. And that personal story actually starts in this room because in 1983 I was named a Harry S. Truman Scholar from Maine, and it was a real highlight in my life and certainly of my parents' life. And we have the picture of me walking up those very stairs and shaking Margaret Truman's hand and receiving that award. And the idea behind the Truman Scholarship is to encourage young people to dedicate themselves to careers in public service. So I went off to graduate school and did some literacy work in Senegal, West Africa, and then I came back to the United States and I directed a Great Society program that was started by Lyndon Johnson under the direction of Sergeant Shriver called Upward Bound, and it helped low-income high school students be the first in their families to go to college. And I did that work first in rural Maine and then with some inner-city students in Springfield and Holyoke, Massachusetts. And when I had those students, I taught them history and politics, and I did two things. I always brought them to the Kennedy Library each summer during our summer program. And I had a number of posters up in my classroom or in my office of individuals who've made a difference in our country's history, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Cesar Chavez, Zora Neale Hurston to, of course, John F. Kennedy. And the poster of John F. Kennedy had a certain quote that you'll hear from in a minute. And so then I went to the Kennedy Library, and we had our 25th anniversary, and we had a treasures exhibit there, the way Mike has one. And John F. Kennedy will always probably be a kid in Harry Truman's eyes, so we are 25 years behind them. But the draft of the quote that I had up on my office before I joined the library was one of those treasures. And it gives you a sense. President Kennedy did not write all of his speeches, but he dramatically improved the drafts that were given to him. And this speech was written by Arthur Schlesinger, so in the corner it says A.S. Jr., and it was given by President Kennedy. It was his last trip home to Massachusetts, and given about a month before he died, dedicating the Robert Frost Library at Amherst College. And here's an example on the first page. We can go to the next slide, where he condenses some words that Arthur Schlesinger wrote. And Schlesinger Robert Frost came from New Hampshire, and Schlesinger has a reference there that Robert Frost was enduring as the granite of the New Hampshire hills. But instead, President Kennedy took a word, the unchallengeable heroes, for Robert Frost was one of the unchallengeable heroes, and instead changed it in the speech for Robert Frost was one of the granite figures of our time. It's really a lovely use of words, I think. So I wanted you to hear 1 minute of the speech. So if we go to the next slide, hopefully you will hear it.
But today, this college and country honors a man whose contribution was not to our size, but to our spirit, not to our political beliefs, but to our insight, not to our self-esteem, but to our self-comprehension. In honoring Robert Frost, we therefore can pay honor to the deepest sources of our national strength. That strength takes many forms, and the most obvious forms are not always the most significant. The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness. But the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when that questioning is disinterested. For they determine whether we use power or power uses us.
And it was that very quote that I had on in the poster in my room with my students about those who question power make a great contribution to our nation because they determine whether we use power or power uses us. And that's actually a quote that we often use when we give out our Profile and Courage Award every year. And probably the most memorable award we ever gave was to President Gerald Ford for his pardoning of President Nixon that brought healing to our nation. So there's one more. This is my favorite edit that President Kennedy made to the draft. Obviously, Robert Frost was a poet, so President Kennedy talked about poetry and power. And Arthur Schlesinger had written, when power, this is the line that's crossed out, when power intoxicates, poetry restores sobriety. And President Kennedy changed that to when power corrupts, poetry cleanses. And even when I say those words, I get kind of a chill. Just such a lovely image. It's a use of poetic words. President Kennedy, I think, used words to stir the nation, to bring out the best of the American people. We try to tell the story in our museum through his voice because it is so stirring. And he closed this speech at the actual groundbreaking of the library with these words. He said, "Libraries are memories." This is, again, he's referring to the Robert Frost Library. "And in this library, you'll have the memory of an extraordinary American." But he said, "Libraries are also the future. And I hope that all of the young people who come into this library will touch something of distinction in our national life and give something back to it." And so it's my hope that of the number of people who, I think first it's a statement that could be said for all presidential libraries, but it's my hope especially that those who come through the John F. Kennedy Library each day are touched by the poetic words of John F. Kennedy and are inspired by the ideals he personified, but that they in turn then give something back to our country and to our world. Thank you.